Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Parsons, and I'm one of your recurring co-hosts on the Thoughtworks Technology Podcast. And we're here today to talk about product organization and engineering organizations. And we have three individuals with us. Rick, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks. I'm Rick Kick. I am the North American head of Enterprise Modernization Platforms and Cloud for Thoughtworks. Kennedy?
I'm Kennedy Collins. I'm the head of product and design for the North America Central Market. Tony?
Hi, I'm Anthony Maitz. I am a product consultant at Pariveda, and I have been doing product management for a good long while.
Excellent. So let's start with an introduction to the problem. This podcast is part of a series that are based on some articles that are being written about the challenges that scale-ups face. And this product and engineering tension is one of those scale-ups. So what exactly is the problem? How do we see it manifest? And what are some of the characteristics of this problem?
I'll take a first crack. So one of the things that Anthony and I actually were just talking about is this article had gotten picked up on some other websites. And one of the pieces of feedback that came in was we don't see friction between product and engineering in startups. And that's a really important thing to start to focus on because we're not talking about startups, we're talking about scale-ups. And scale-ups then they grow into larger organizations. So when you think about a startup, there's some regular level of organized chaos, right? But as that organization starts to grow and scale, you need to switch from organized chaos into more chaotic organization, right? And you need to start to put product managers together with other product managers and engineers with other engineers in these structural organizational pods. What happens then is that the organization generally starts to have some top-down goals. Those goals get translated into localized OKRs. And now that management layer is actually focused on how do I make my product managers better product managers and how do I make my engineers better engineers? And that's where those silos start to evolve, right? And what we're talking about here is how do we start to break through those silos and build tunnels between those organizations around creating better value. So the problem is normal for companies to experience, but it's also a problem that we have to solve for.
I'll add a couple of things. I think to Rick's point, one of the reasons we're talking about this in the context of scale-ups is, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, but also because scaling this way and choosing to kind of organize, at least to some extent, around functional organizations and having, a CTO or a VP of product and that kind of thing, it makes sense. It's efficient in a way that we've found, and organizational theory has found is really efficient, right? It's often really hard to have folks who are not, at least to some extent, experts in the work that they're doing, leading folks who are doing that kind of work, right? People trust and need that kind of expertise, but that organizational structure has a lot of downsides, right? And so it is really efficient, but we need to be careful and understand where is it good, where is it bad, and how can we mitigate the bad parts while getting all of the good parts?
Yeah, it sounds reminiscent, actually, of some of the discussions that we often have about how you can either optimize for efficiency, and so you have pools of resources. Here are my DBAs, here are my developers, et cetera, or you can optimize for speed, where okay, I'm going to form, a product team that has designers and DBAs and developers and, you build it, you run it. And well, if you don't, if you need 3/4 of a DBA for one team and, 3/4 of a DBA for another and a half for a third, well, if you had a pooled resource, you could do that with 2 DBAs, but if you've got 3 teams, you're going to have three DBAs. And so you give up efficiency for speed to market or other kinds of more market-facing goals. And it sounds like this is just another instance of that, where you're where we're looking to gain that level of organizational efficiency, as well as career development. I actually just got off a conversation with somebody that says, you know, a project manager can evaluate a developer on whether they met their deadlines on time, but they can't necessarily evaluate the strength of that developer, the cleanliness of their code, et cetera. And they can't really give that developer, a vision of a career path either, because they're not a more senior technologist. So I see some strong parallels there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that the organizational changes that come along with this are required in some way. It's very different to run a team of 400 people than it is 40. And I think a lot of the definitions that we use kind of interchangeably for these development teams between these two realities can get us into trouble too. Speed when you're 40 people or less, when you're a new startup, speed often does mean time to getting feedback from users. When we talk about speed, we're talking about learning speed. Speed when we talk about an engineering group of 400 plus, or an organization in the upper hundreds. We're really talking about velocity, and it's actually a lot slower and harder to measure individual impact of changes because so many changes are happening and so many people are involved, but also the number of users tends to be a lot higher. So there's a lot more stakeholder input and input from direct users as opposed to competitive input and market research. You're dealing with your own kind of inertia and mass. And that mass gives you power in certain situations, but it does come with other considerations. You're never going to move as fast, regardless, as a 400 person org as you did as a 14 person org for any number of reasons. But I think we continue to use those same terms from earlier in the organization, and it kind of belies the reality on the ground. Like it kind of ruins the ability to communicate about some of the nuance here.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I spent a lot of time working in startups before I joined Thoughtworks. And one of the things that I found and have heard over and over again is like when a company doubles in size, that's not a difference in degree anymore. That's a difference in kind. It's a different kind of beast, and the way you have to manage it is different.
Well, and the reality of a lot of these companies hitting startup or hitting, their Series C or D, is that the kind of expectation, the requirement for accepting that funding is to double in size, and sometimes repeatedly. So 1 year to the next, you'll need to double, and then the next year again. And the reality there is like it's not the same company. Like even by the numbers, by percentage, it's just a different thing on top of the same product. And so I think that is also, it's just a thing that no one really ever acknowledges. Like the mythos of the startup is that it's an unbroken line up and to the right with only correct decisions made and only scaling and success. And I don't think anyone who's ever worked at a company like that believes that's true in practice.
One of the things that I think is important, though, that's specific to the friction that we're talking about between product and engineering as it relates to the growth, is that how this manifests itself in an organization is a litmus test of what the priorities of the organization are, right? And that's where I think the friction actually escalates beyond normal friction between, let's say, an engineer, a developer, and a DBA, right? We're talking about what's the priority of the business. Is the priority of the business growth? Is the priority of business stability? Is it right? This is where that friction starts to come in, because we've got what we see are two conflicting camps that don't need to be conflicting. They need to be aligned. They need to be on the same page as what the priorities of the business are. But often we see them fighting for each other for a limited amount of time and scope to deliver new value.
I was gonna say, like that alignment is so hard when you're in that hyper growth phase, because like it's just a mathematical truism. I can't remember the word I want here. It's just, if you just do the math, if you're doubling every year, then half your company has been there less than a year. That's what that means. And it's so hard to keep that drumbeat, to keep that alignment.
So it sounds like this is an inevitable place to get to, but how do you recognize when you've gotten to it? And then we'll talk about what do you do to get out of it. But let's start with how do you start to recognize? I mean, is it simply the fact that you now have a head of product and and a head of engineering, or is there something more fundamental that you also see that gives rise to, oh, now the downsides of this organization are outweighing the benefits that we're getting from this structure?
I was on a roundtable yesterday, and one of the attendees was talking about how they've been making some really evolutionary changes inside their organization. And one of the other attendees said, "How did you do that?" And he said, "I had a partner in product who saw the same problems that I did and wanted to solve them." Right. So just because you've got an organizational split between product and engineering doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have conflict, right? As long as those two organizations are the same mind and have the same ideas to what the problems are and the same ideas of how to solve them, right? I think one of the challenges, though, from what are some of the indicators? There's lots of indicators. One of the calls that I was having earlier is around the growth of tech debt, right? And if you think about some of the recent news headlines around the holidays, around some issues with companies not addressing their tech debt, right? Those are good indicators of things that you can point to say, how's that relationship between engineering and product working out, right? When you've got outages affecting, I don't know, half of the United States.
I'll even go back. I'll make it more fundamental to build on that. I think if you're using the euphemism tech debt, you're already gone. Like, it's just debt. Like, it costs money to fix. It's just debt. And the euphemism of tech debt. And I've heard lots of variants. I've been guilty of this. I've used lots of variants: product debt, tech debt, whatever. Like, you make up words as a way to justify to stakeholders who are pissed about it, that you're not going to be doing the necessary work to keep the thing you just made stable. Right. And I think if it's said at all, it means that there's been some compromise along the line, because it was more important to get the feature out or the story done than it was to do it thoroughly and correctly. And so you're always kind of robbing from the future.
Yeah. But oftentimes with high growth startups, that's necessary, right? You are making a bet on the future, and you are borrowing from the future in order to make it possible today, which is an acceptable decision, but you just got to be careful about it. To go back to the question quickly, though, one of the heuristics I've found really helpful is there's a moment, it depends on the company and what you're doing and how aligned it is, but in the 30 to 60 range, in my experience, where you stop having a sense of what everyone's doing. Like, there's a point where you kind of know what everybody's up to. And there's a moment where you're like, I don't even know who that person is in the kitchen.
Kennedy, you had said something earlier about, I'm going to paraphrase it wrong, so I'll just rephrase it. You get to a point where there's so much going on that as you hire new people, they're not added to existing teams. They're used for new things, new functions. And you're not, it's a lack of focus. And it's hard to tell what the right amount of focus should be. But I do think if you've kind of lived through the startup into the scale up, you start to notice not only that you don't necessarily know what's going on, but there are whole parts of the org you've never heard of. And I think we talk about the tension, and I don't want to derail this too much. We talk about the tension between product and engineering, but that's just the one that I think most often articulate. I think there's a similar tension between engineering and customer success, or product and sales, or product and business development. Because it really has to do with every individual part of the organization starts being responsible for their own goals and outcomes. And so then you have to align those goals, as opposed to it being focused at the company level of what you're trying to accomplish. And I do think that happens between multiple orgs. Although I do think product and engineering is probably one of the first to cause real pain when you're in this scale.
Yeah, and one of the things that we talk about in the article that I think is really important is culturally, when you start to get into the rhythm of finger pointing, right? When you start to get into that rhythm of us and them, right? Of, well, they don't give us what we need, or they're not delivering fast enough, or that conversation is really, really good indicator that friction exists, right? And you've got a wall to break down.
Well, and it's a reality of where we're at. Rebecca earlier mentioned, and I love that you mentioned this, the career development. One of the things we want as ICs in these organizations is a sense of progression of our own career. Very often, if you're hired as part of the doubling of one of these groups, you haven't been there very long, and you don't know that you will be there very often in these startups. And so you're trying to see your own path forward. So we expect a maturity. But with that maturity comes a lot of let's say, questionable incentives that happen kind of maybe accidentally at first, but are important. I think a new middle manager being hired, they really need to make an impact in their first quarter to show their value, especially at a company that's moving so fast. Where next year, if they're successful, their team will double, and if not, they'll be kind of relegated to the sidelines. And so that's a real economic incentive for that person, and a personal incentive for them to make an impact. And there, I think, are hundreds of these going on. It doesn't mean that it's a good decision for the business necessarily, but it is a real consequence and something that those people need. They need to understand their own progression and stability. But it does, I think, introduce a shadow stakeholder in a way of your like career self versus your kind of what you're supposed to be doing on the team.
And that gets back also to the what you all were talking about earlier, the fact that there clearly do have to be, lower level goals, but if they don't roll up in support of a unified and aligned goal, then you're going to have people running in different directions because that's what they feel like they should be doing to succeed. I've been given this set of goals, and therefore I should achieve these goals. And if they aren't properly aligned and don't uh, sync up properly, then obviously it's going to all go horribly wrong. So then how do we fix this? What are some things that we can do to start to break through these silos? I did hear one thing about we need tunnels between our silos, but what kinds of approaches have you seen work?
Well, I'll start this one. For me, there's only really one kind of approach at the team level. I think there's lots of ways to accomplish it from the managerial perspective. But on an individual team, you're looking at getting all of your kind of representatives included in the solving of the problem. And I think even at very large organizations, when you see them be successful, they have aligned teams around value and purpose. And so they have given a team everyone that they need within the team to accomplish the job. And the team will have a very clear understanding of the value. And I think when that happens, it kind of is automatic that everyone is seen as a puzzle solver together, and the problem becomes the focus. So it sounds, I think, very simple, but it is hard to do this. Like I don't want to like pretend like it's very easy to reorganize. But by having your teams organized around specific value adds or purposes, as opposed to kind of a, well, I'm not very into sports, but I'm going to strain a metaphor here. Instead of a zone defense, instead of owning an area of code, you own a function or an actual output of the business. It gives you purpose. It gives you autonomy. You're able to develop, I think, a little deeper. And that's possible in any of these org structures. Like that comes down to just the individual team building level. You could still have a product org, an eng org, a QA org. I've seen like you can still have separate organizations as long as at the actual doing the work level, you've kind of aligned a team and given everyone that team needs in the team. I think you want to avoid the teams having to go back through the rigmarole because you'll have to go through the management layer again.
Yeah.
To go off of Rebecca's rowing analogy, making sure that if you see in an organization where you're having conversations at a leadership level of how do we make sure that the product organization, the engineering organization, the QA are all rowing in the same direction, that's the wrong conversation. You're all in the same boat, right? Right. And it's how do you get your organization to understand that we've got different product teams. They are all in one boat. And now the question is, do we all get them rowing in the same cadence? Right. But you're all in the same boat. And if you're thinking about you're all in different boats, you're having the wrong conversation.
Yeah. A couple of things there around kind of how you actually kind of get those things aligned, right? One of the things that I've found, two things that I found really helpful. One is kind of creating, information radiators or kind of pull-based places where people can go and learn and go and find out what other people are working on and go and find out what the organizational goals are, right? Having to ask someone, having to find out for yourself, having to creating an expectation that someone's going to deliver that to you on a silver platter is challenging. But saying, hey, you can go look and you can find out at any time, and it's kind of your job to know where you're supposed to be rowing is a really helpful mechanism. The other thing I was going to say quickly, if I can, and then please, is this idea of singular accountability but shared responsibilities, right? And this is kind of when we get into how do you have a cross-functional team that's all pulling in the same direction. Well, I am, as a product manager, accountable for certain things. You are, as an engineer, accountable for certain things, but we're all responsible for the outcomes, right? And kind of having splitting it that way, and it feels lovely and clean and messy or whatever to chop everything up and say everyone has their own responsibilities and their own little buckets. That doesn't actually work. Um, Saying, oh, we can all be responsible for shared stuff, and you and I can both be responsible, but ultimately someone's accountable at the end of the day. That tends to be a pattern that works really well in my experience.
I think along with that, one of the anti patterns I see very often is that the roadmap becomes owned by a specific person or role on a team, as opposed to being the kind of marketplace where the different factors or the different realities that we're dealing with are debated and prioritized as a group. Again, that's where tech debt, things like that, I think start coming into play, is when you have one person who isn't representing that debt describing it. But I think Kennedy, to kind of build off what you're saying, is if I'm responsible for market fit, if I'm responsible for delivering the thing that is the customers are requesting, and you as an engineer are responsible for making sure it's stable and actually performs the function, and the QA is there to make sure that we understand that it actually did the thing. Like, each of those are important prioritizers when we think of a roadmap. And so all of those people should be involved in the prioritization. All of those people on the team at the team level should be involved in that. And I think that an anti-pattern that happens very often, that if you catch yourself in, you can break, is when PMs, I think this happens very often with PMs, when they prioritize in a bubble and then they compare their priorities to other PMs, as opposed to comparing their priorities to the engineer on the team, or comparing their priorities to what customer success is saying is the reality of the operational cost of what you've made. When you start saying, well, between the PMs, we all need to figure it out because then we're going to move engineers around and try to resource it. I think that's a time to reflect and say, okay, wait a second. Let's bring those other people in and have them prioritize these individuals before we start comparing them to each other, because you lose a lot if you start trying to treat individuals, PMs, engineers, anyone, as widgets that can be changed between priorities in that way. And I think those come hand in hand.
Yeah. To elaborate, kind of just to kind of take that accountability and responsibility thing I was talking about, like, I think your product manager, someone should be accountable that there is a good roadmap that has everyone's input, right? The product manager can be accountable for that, but everyone's responsible for making sure the roadmap is good and pointing in the right direction, right? And providing that input.
I know we've been talking a lot about the specific members of a delivery team, but I also make sure that we don't forget the importance of management, right? And what we talked about earlier was this idea that your delivery teams are a good mirror of the relationships of management, right? And if your leadership at the VP of product and the VP of engineering, if that relationship is contentious, you're going to have contention in the delivery teams, right? So making sure that at that VP level, at the director level, at the manager level, there is cohesion of vision, cohesion of purpose across those two different teams. That's going to pay off in dividends in your delivery teams too.
And a shared definition of success between those orgs, like that is so often skipped over. And because of that, definition of success can fall through often from like a strong CEO or from someone who is really dictating from pretty far away from it. But a clearly defined value metric for what you're accomplishing can negate so many of these kind of situations you're in, even if you started that way. As long when you get to brass tacks of trying to move a specific value for the company, if it's real, you'll kind of self-correct these because you'll throw enough elbows.
Yeah, absolutely. One of like the core ideas that comes out of kind of XP in particular is this idea of focusing on principles over practices, right? And saying, what are the principles we're trying to achieve here? What are the values? What are the goals? And then the practices, they can come and go. And we should be skeptical of our practices if they're not achieving the goals, values, principles we're trying to achieve, right? And I think exactly that point, like velocity, having a good roadmap. These are all input metrics. These are all proxies for the thing we really care about, which is creating real value for customers in ways that also creates real value for the organization. And when you have that, you can have a reasonable discussion about, well, is this actually getting us where we want to go? And if not, you get into stupid arguments about velocity because you don't have something that you're evaluating that against. What's our velocity? If we're making dollars, does it matter? Like,
It's a great point, but it's also another checkpoint to catch yourself in. If you find yourself arguing over capacity and velocity, it's a good indication that you should try to reframe that conversation to value for the company and the impact that you plan to have. This comes from an old thought worker that I love and hope is doing well somewhere, but Scott Moots would say, you need to call your shots. And I feel like it's very often overlooked in these elaborate planning processes for someone to just say, this is what I think will happen when we do this, as opposed to saying, I'm going to make this metric go up 20%, to start with the assumption that, like, I don't know what the ultimate impact will be. I think it's this. So I'm going to say it out loud for everyone so that you can anchor against me and I can learn against you. And that often, it's scary to communicate in that way. It's scary to say you don't know. It's scary to say, you on paper for your promotion, you want to say, I'm going to raise this 20% because I was told to. And I did. Look, we did 24%. I beat it by, whatever. So I think just that humility that comes with, like, I don't know what this is, like what's going to happen, but I think it's going to be this, is another way to diffuse when you catch yourself in that situation. I really like what you said about that, because arguing about velocity happens constantly and it quickly becomes moral and philosophical. Like it quickly becomes like this argument against widgetizing humans, when really I think it's much simpler than that. It's just two different teams don't know how to measure each other. And so this is the lowest common denominator. It's the easiest thing to get quickly, and it works best for like spreadsheets.
Yeah. And this is where we get into other stuff that's probably a little bit out of scope here, like things like, safe and scaled agile frameworks and stuff. And it's, to some extent, one of the, I think exactly our point is, like, if you give teams business goals, if you give teams goals based on value they're trying to create, and that can be based on a theory, right? If we increase this user behavior metric, then it'll help our business, sure. But if you give them that, then who cares what process they're using? Now, if they're not succeeding, we should, as leaders, come in and intervene and help them figure out a process that's going to be successful. But if they're succeeding, scoreboard, like, that's what matters.
Right. I mean, within limits, right? I mean, you don't want to spend 10 million to make one, right? So, right. So within limits, we want to make sure that we've got some level of efficiency in our engineering organizations, but tying all of that efficiency to customer and business values is ultimately the punchline.
I think something that I've very rarely seen, but would help with a lot of this, is the idea of calling when something is meant to be retired, killed, or when you know that it didn't work. So much of this is focused on the fact that it is imperative for each individual manager and team who wants to progress to show success and progress. And so things that aren't working, things that are taking longer than they should, things that should probably be shut off because they didn't have the impact, instead get tainted by a narrative that a handful of people needed in their political reality or personal reality. Yeah. But then the company just has to carry forward. And so the 10 to make one is a great example of, like, before that got launched, was there a statement? And it shouldn't be hard to make. It is hard to, I think, execute politically, but it shouldn't be hard to say, like, if this doesn't show X by this date, our hypothesis is wrong, and we should reevaluate whether or not to support it at all. Instead of, like, what often happens in these scale ups is that you have all these weird, unending experiments that just kind of continue in the code and drag everything else down.
Yeah, I mean, it's zero-based budgeting applied to software priorities. It has to justify its existence. You don't have to. It's not the other way around. It doesn't stay unless you can say why it gets killed. It goes unless you can convince us it stays.
Well, and organizationally, though, it is very difficult to say this hypothesis did not turn out, but there was a valid reason to think it would. And therefore, it's not that people messed up. It's that, there was something there to learn that we didn't know. Versus, maybe it was just a bad idea. Maybe it is a good idea, but the team screwed it up so much that we couldn't even see whether or not it might succeed because there was a delivery failure. I mean, organizationally, it's much easier to just always declare success, and anything that doesn't look good, oh, failure, as opposed to seeing what you can learn from those middle those middle areas where there is actually a lot of learning to be had.
Well, everyone talks about failing fast, but like, have any of you ever seen that supported in practice at beyond like the earliest startup phase? Like, no one is saying, "Oh, your $6 million initiative failed in 3 months." Like, great, what a great learning. And maybe they should, but I think you're absolutely right, Rebecca. It's very hard in an organization to think that way, even though that's the truth of what's happening very often.
Yep. So, is there any sense in which, as a scale up continues to scale and grow, that we can ever declare this problem done, or does it actually change character and need constant attention? Even once you've addressed the initial instance of, oh, we've got an us versus them now.
Yeah. My opinion on it is if your organization and its goals never change, then you can get to a finishing point. But if your organization's changing or its goals are changing, then you probably can't, which is to say, no.
I mean, all living things change over time. I agree. If you're in a situation where your org and purpose is completely static, and I'm sure some astute listeners can articulate a handful of very specific cases where that's true. But the reality is the economy changes, the expectations change, the individual employees' expectations change. People leave your org, and there's any number of reasons why, and many of them are healthy reasons. So you're going to kind of always be renegotiating this relationship, and I think that is not only healthy, like I think that's a good thing. You should be renegotiating, but I think that the earlier you think of it as an ongoing negotiation, the healthier those discussions are going to be for you.
And I would add that we were talking with a global fintech company who was suffering from this exact problem. And one of the things that was said in the conversation, I thought was really impactful, was while the scale of the problem has been magnified globally, the number of opportunities to solve it has also magnified, right? So the chance that you can solve it locally, you can solve it regionally, you can solve it, right? Then your opportunities to knock down this wall has also magnified. It's just whether or not you take the energy to do it.
Yeah, and I also think it goes back to what Kennedy was saying earlier about principles over practices. The specific implementations of some of these fixes are going to vary based on scale. But the principles of alignment that we're trying to achieve, those are probably not going to change and are not or should not be driven by things like personalities and things of that nature, but more, this is the value that we're trying to deliver, and everything is going to be focused around this.
And how you solve it locally can be varied, right? I mean, the point is solve it.
Yeah. I think being aligned around real value fixes so many of these issues. Like so often the frustration comes with, and this is not just between product and eng, but within an org, within engineering talking to their managers or within product, like in their roadmap planning. So much of it comes from the fact that a lot of the effort isn't measurable and isn't value based. And our
Yeah.
quarterly structure doesn't really give us the time it takes for complex things to get feedback. And so the idea that you have this whole list waiting for you next quarter, and engineering's, their private list is growing each quarter. Um, it it doesn't. It's easy to pretend like you're still organized on value, but really you're organized on a to-do list and making sure that
Yeah.
to-do list doesn't get very big. So just truing up to the actual value, everyone knowing and caring very deeply about what actually is happening and what the impact was, and being as an organization trying to learn patience to wait for the real results as opposed to using those leading indicators. I think it's easier to do than it seems, but I do think it's scary to make that change for a lot of people because there are individual implications for your career, for your position, for your political clout. But it is the balm. I think it's a universal balm for this.
Yeah.
I think one of the other challenges, though, sorry, Kennedy, is that it's also there's a level of trust that has to be developed between the business and the product plus engineering delivery team, right, to say, I actually entrust this team with this business value outcome, right? So many people in the business believe that they own business outcomes, right? When that's somewhat of a fallacy, if you start to peel back the layers. And so that trust that has to be developed, that you've only ever been able to move as fast as your engineering and product organization, just own that and lean into it. That's really hard for a lot of organizations to come to grips with.
Yeah, and I think that's something to say. We wrote this article with the frame of scale ups, right? But this is something that applies to any organization that's larger than one team, basically. And the way it looks is really different. But I think in particular, though, to your point, Rick, like this applies to more and more organizations, even ones that aren't kind of technology startups or, coming up with technology-based, digital products, that kind of stuff. And exactly your point, right? Like, the software is eating the world, to quote Mark Andreessen, right? Like, you don't have a business without the software. Like, it's not, if all the software went away tomorrow or the technology went away tomorrow, your business would be unable to run and materially different, probably. And so to me, it's strange not to entrust those folks who already run part of your business, whether you want them to or not, with the business outcomes you're trying to achieve.
Whether you acknowledge it or not. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I would offer I've seen these people suffer so many times in these orgs. If you ever find yourself even congratulating yourself that engineering and product are aligned, or that your viewpoint has been successful, go talk to customer support. Like go and actually sit time with customer support, because even in aligned teams, like it's easy to pretend like this is the crux of the world, but the people actually talking to the individuals suffering through your decisions every day, I think is a humbling experience that more people should experience, because I really liked when you said it's any team with multiple orgs. It really is multiple orgs that we're talking about. Product and engineering are the two that I think scale super fast, and so they run into some of these problems in a more dramatic and immediate way. But all of the scale ups I've been at have suffering customer support teams with queues that are going long and customers getting frustrated. It's very rare for someone to have prioritized that along the path. And so the same reason, or the same point of this relationship between product and engineering needs care and feeding over time. Once you think you have this one solved, go and build bridges to other parts of the org, because at the end of the day, all of them are necessary to delivering the value to customers. And they might, represent different edge cases or different types of customers. But I think you're going to find the same situation anytime a team has a different way to prioritize.
Yeah, you're calling out specifically customer support, I think, is so important too. So often I see with our clients this like, oh, the business wants. And I am so allergic to that. And the thing I do all the time is just like, who do you mean? Do you mean like Dave in marketing? Do you mean Sharon in sales? Like, what do you mean the business? Like, we're all part of this business. So who are you actually talking about, both organizationally and like the person? Because the business is not a monolith. It's a bunch of people too, just like we are over here.
Excellent. Well, I'd like to thank you all, Rick, Kennedy, Anthony, for a quite a wide-ranging conversation. It got a little dark there for a while, but it feels like, this is actually a problem that can be solved if we acknowledge that it exists. So I would like to thank you all for your participation.
Thanks, Rebecca. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And I agree, it is solvable. It's not all darkness.
Excellent.
It's just work.